Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we are diving into a really interesting story. It's kind of a puzzle, really, about how people figured out how old the Earth is and how life changed over time. And there's this bird, the great auk. It's a really important part of that story. The original penguin, I think they call it. And we have some great sources today that go into all of this. I especially like the chapter all about the original penguin and what was going on in science when it went extinct.
Yeah, that chapter is great, and it's really going to guide our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We are going to be exploring how ideas about the Earth and about life were changing, and we're going to use the story of the Great Auk to see how that all fits together.
All right, so to set the stage here, our sources start out in 1832 when this guy, William Whewell, invented these two terms, catastrophist and uniformitarian. And this wasn't just some boring scientific jargon. These terms represent two totally different ways of thinking about the planet.
Absolutely. So at the time, most people were catastrophists. Catastrophists thought that the Earth's history was shaped by these big sudden events like, huge floods, massive earthquakes, that kind of thing. But then along comes this guy, Charles Lyell, and he has a totally different idea. And Whewell called him a uniformitarian.
So what was so different about Lyell's work?
Yeah.
What did he see that made him come up with this new way of thinking about the Earth?
Well, Lyell actually started out studying law. He wasn't a geologist at first, so he kind of came at it from a new angle. He traveled around a lot and was really careful about observing rocks and the landscape. And he was really struck by the power of these slow processes that are still happening today, like the way sediment builds up or how wind and water wear away at rock volcanic eruptions. And he realized that these processes happening over really long periods of time could explain the features of the Earth. This was his big idea. The present is the key to the past. All the stuff we see today, all the mountains and valleys and canyons, it was all created by these same processes acting over millions and millions of years.
So how did this idea of slow, gradual change apply to something as dramatic as extinction?
Well, for Lyell, extinction was just like everything else. It had to be a really slow process, so slow that you might not even notice it happening during a human lifetime. And, there was this fossil record that seemed to show species disappearing suddenly. But Lyell said that the fossil record wasn't complete. We were missing parts of the story. He even thought that some species that seemed to have disappeared, maybe they were still out there somewhere and could reappear in the future.
Wow, so he's imagining a world where creatures that have been gone for a long time could just come back. That is really different from the idea of these sudden extinction events. But the fossil records seem to point to those big events. How did people make sense of that?
Yeah, that was a big debate. But then this guy, Charles Darwin, comes along. He had just finished up at Cambridge, and he takes Lyell's new book, Principles of Geology, with him on this voyage on the HMS Beagle. And that trip ended up changing the way Darwin thought about everything.
Yeah, because he wasn't just reading about Lyell's ideas, he was actually seeing them in action, right?
Exactly. So he's on this island, St. Jago, in the Cape Verde Islands, and he sees this layer of limestone way up high on these volcanic cliffs. And that means that the land must have been lifted up slowly over a really long time, just like Lyell said. Darwin even wrote that this one spot convinced me of the infinite superiority of Lyell's views. He was so into Lyell's book, he actually had the other volumes shipped to him during the 5-year voyage.
Wow, he must have been hooked.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just that slow uplift. There was also that huge earthquake in Chile that really showed him the power of these gradual forces.
That's right. Darwin actually experienced a really strong earthquake in Valdivia, and then when he got to Concepcion, he found the city in ruins. The harbor had actually been lifted up almost 8 feet by the earthquake. And this was more evidence for Lyell's idea that these small changes could really add up over time and make huge differences to the Earth, create mountains and things like that. Darwin said later that reading Principles altered the whole tone of one's mind.
Wow, that's quite an endorsement. So Darwin is totally on board with Lyell's idea of slow, gradual change when it comes to the Earth. But they didn't agree about everything right. Lyell didn't buy into the idea that species could change over time, did he?
No, he did not. He really resisted that idea, which was called species transmutation. The idea that one species could slowly change into another species. He even used this experiment where they looked at mummified cats from ancient Egypt, and they didn't seem to be that different from modern cats, so he thought that showed that species didn't change. He did agree that new species appeared in the fossil record, but he thought they must have been created somehow. It almost seemed like he was saying there had to be some kind of miracle to explain new species, even though he didn't believe in miracles for geology.
It's like he needed a special explanation for biology that he didn't need for the Earth itself. And this is where Darwin's idea of natural selection comes in, right?
Hmm.
It provided a natural explanation for how species could gradually change, just like the Earth changes gradually.
Exactly. Darwin was really smart because he figured out a way that change could happen in the natural world. He saw natural selection as this process that was always happening, always testing out little variations in living things, and the ones that worked better for survival and reproduction, those were the ones that would succeed. And over many, many generations, this process could lead to new species, just like erosion and sedimentation could create new landscapes. In both cases, the present is the key to the past.
And natural selection didn't just explain how new species could appear, it also explained how they could disappear.
You got it. Darwin said that extinction was just a natural part of this struggle for existence. When new species appeared that were better suited to their environment, they would outcompete the older species, and eventually those older species would go extinct. He even compared it to how people breed cattle. They would pick the best cows and get rid of the ones that didn't produce as much milk. He said it was like a murderous pestilence for the less favored types. He didn't think extinction was some big mystery. It was just a natural process that usually happened very slowly.
Which brings us to the story of the great auk,
Hmm.
which is kind of a wrench in the works here because its extinction wasn't slow and gradual. It happened really fast and everyone could see it happening. And it was definitely caused by humans. This seems to go against Darwin's idea that extinction is this slow background process.
You're right. While Darwin was developing his theory about slow, gradual extinction, the great auk, a bird that lived in the North Atlantic, was rapidly disappearing, and it was all because of people hunting them. This was a really obvious example of human-caused extinction that happened way faster than the kind of extinction that Darwin was talking about, which was driven by competition between species over a long time.
Our source takes us to Iceland and tells about this stuffed great auk that is kept at the Icelandic Institute of Natural History. And it's a really interesting story because it was owned by this Danish count, and then Icelanders bought it back and brought it home. It sounds like this bird became a symbol of something that Iceland had lost.
Oh, it definitely did. The great auk represents something precious that was lost forever. And it was an impressive bird. It was big, over 2.5 feet tall, and it couldn't fly. It had these strong wings for swimming and a really unique beak with a ridge on it. Even just seeing the stuffed bird, you can tell it was a powerful creature.
And they lived all over the place, from Norway to Newfoundland and even down to Italy and Florida. And our source says they were actually the original penguins.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Before Europeans went to the southern hemisphere and saw the penguins we know today, the great auk was what people called a penguin. No one is really sure where the word penguin comes from, but it makes sense that both birds got the same name because they lived in similar ways. They were both really good swimmers and spent a lot of time in the water, but they were clumsy on land, especially when they were nesting. The great auk was part of Iceland's ecosystem for a long time, even before people started living there. They found great auk bones in 10th century trash pits, and people back then described them as easy prey.
But it sounds like when Europeans started coming to North America to fish for cod, that's when things really went downhill for the great auk, especially in this place called Funk Island off of Newfoundland. It sounds like that island was covered in great auks.
Oh, yeah. Funk Island, also called Isle of Birds or Penguin Island, was a huge breeding colony, probably one of the biggest. In the 1500s, European explorers like Jacques Cartier said that the great auks were as big as geese, and there were so many of them that you could fill up a boat in half an hour as if they had been stones. So they were incredibly abundant and really easy to catch.
And they didn't hold back, did they? It sounds like they used every single part of the bird.
No, they used everything, and it was really brutal. They ate them, they used them as bait to catch fish, they took their feathers to make pillows and blankets. There are even stories of people plucking the feathers off live birds. And this is really disturbing, but there's a story from the sailor Aaron Thomas who said that they used the birds' bodies to fuel the fires that they used to cook other great auks. Imagine that. There are probably about 100,000 pairs of great auks on Funk Island, and they only lay one egg per year.
That's horrible, taking so many birds, especially when they only lay one egg a year.
Yeah.
That had to have a huge impact on their numbers.
Oh, yeah, it was devastating. By the late 1700s, the number of great auks had plummeted, mostly because of the feather trade. People would go to Funk Island and spend the whole summer just killing birds and plucking their feathers.
Mhm.
By the 1830s, John James Audubon, the famous bird artist, went looking for great auks on Funk Island, but he couldn't find any. They were already gone.
So by that point, the last big colony of great auks was on this island called Geirfuglasker off the coast of Iceland. And then to make things worse, The island was submerged by a volcano. The remaining birds had to move to a nearby island called Eldey.
Yeah, that volcanic eruption in the early 1800s was a real disaster for the great auks. There weren't many left, and then they lost their main breeding ground. And as they got rarer and rarer, they became more valuable to collectors. People would pay a lot of money for their skins and eggs. That's actually how that stuffed bird in Iceland ended up with the Danish count. So people were still hunting them even though there were hardly any left.
Which leads to that really sad story of the last pair of great auks being killed on Eldey in 1844.
Hmm.
They were killed by some Icelandic guys who were working for collectors, and they even crushed the last egg by accident.
We actually know a lot about that last killing because these two British naturalists, John Woolley and Alfred Newton, went to Iceland in 1858 hoping to find some great auks. They didn't know the birds were already extinct. When they got there, they heard the story of the 1844 killing, and they tracked down some of the skins and specimens that had been collected from those last birds.
It sounds like that trip to Iceland was really important for Newton.
Oh.
It showed him how extinction could happen really fast, and he became a big advocate for protecting seabirds. And it's interesting that he was also one of the first people to really understand and support Darwin's theory of natural selection.
Yeah, there's a connection there. Newton read Darwin's first paper on natural selection right after he got back from Iceland, and he was immediately convinced. He said it was like a direct revelation. He even started writing letters to Darwin. And seeing how the great auk, which laid only one egg a year, was driven to extinction so quickly probably made him realize how vulnerable some species are to human actions.
But here's something I don't get. If Newton was so into Darwin's theory, and they were writing to each other, why didn't they ever talk about the great auk? Our source points out that Darwin never mentions the great auk's extinction in his writing or in his letters to Newton. But we know that Darwin knew about human-caused extinction from his travels on the Beagle, didn't he?
Yeah, that is strange, isn't it? But Darwin definitely knew about extinction caused by humans. When he was in the Galapagos Islands, he saw how whaling ships were killing tons of giant tortoises for food. He even talked to this guy, Nicholas Lawson, who was like the governor of Charles Island. And Lawson said that the tortoises on that island would probably be extinct in 20 years. And he was right. They disappeared even faster than that.
And in Darwin's book on the origin of species, he even mentions extinction happening wholly through man's agency. It's almost like he just assumes that his readers already know about that kind of extinction.
Yeah, it's a quick comment, but it shows that people were aware of human-caused extinction back then. So here's the big question. How did Darwin fit these really fast human-caused extinctions into his theory about slow, gradual change driven by natural selection? That's the puzzle.
It's like there are two possibilities, right? Either human-caused extinction is totally different from natural extinction,
Right.
which means humans are somehow outside of the natural world that Darwin was describing. Or maybe it means that extinction can happen really fast sometimes, which would kind of support the catastrophist that Darwin disagreed with.
It makes you think about the different ways that extinction can happen. Darwin was focused on the long game, how species compete with each other over millions of years. But the great auk shows that a single species, humans, can wipe out another species in a very short time just by hunting it too much.
So what we're left with is this really interesting picture. Lyell comes up with this idea of slow, gradual change for the Earth. Darwin builds on that with his theory of natural selection. And then we have this tragic story of the great auk, which shows that extinction can happen way faster than Darwin imagined, especially when humans are involved.
The great auk is a powerful reminder that extinction is real and it can happen quickly. And it makes us think about our own role in the natural world. We have a huge impact on other species, and sometimes that impact is negative. The great auk is more than just a sad story, it's a warning to us.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Darwin was focused on these big natural processes, but maybe he didn't fully appreciate the power that humans have to change the world. The great auk is a reminder that we need to be careful about our impact on the planet and on other species.
That's exactly right. So I'll leave you with this question. How did the extinction of the great auk change the way people understood Darwin's theory of natural selection? And what does it tell us about our own responsibility for the future of life on Earth? Those are questions worth thinking about.